What if America banned alcohol today? Just think about that for a second. Imagine the absolute logistical nightmare. Imagine the public reaction. I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind as we go through this explainer, because what we're really studying today is the ultimate masterclass in the law of unintended consequences. How exactly does a society attempt to eradicate a massive social evil, only to accidentally engineer an even darker, far more dangerous underworld? Well, to understand why the ban happened in the first place, we really need to look at the culture that provoked it. Let's start with Chapter 1, A Nation of Drinkers. So back in the 1700s and 1800s, finding clean drinking water was actually incredibly difficult. City water sources were often just stagnant wells or small rivers, completely contaminated by raw sewage. It got to the point where doctors were literally advising people to drink whiskey instead of water. And thanks to a huge surplus of corn and rapid industrial distillation, whiskey was cheaper than a cup of coffee, which led to this truly staggering number: 88 bottles. By 1830, the average American over the age of 15 was putting away 88 bottles of whiskey a year. That is 3 times the modern consumption rate. People drank when they were sad, they drank when they were happy, and they even drank heavily on the job. Workplaces literally had bell hours that rang twice a day, specifically signaling workers to take a break and go drink. Now, as you might guess, this extreme level of consumption led to utter social devastation. You had intoxicated workers operating dangerous, heavy industrial machinery, which predictably led to horrific workplace amputations and deaths. Then there were what people called Saturday night tragedies. Men would go to the bar, spend half their weekly wages, and return home violently. Keep in mind, this was an era before domestic abuse was widely recognized or regulated in any meaningful way. Crime just absolutely skyrocketed. At one point, 80% of all court crimes in New York were directly linked to drunkenness. It got so incredibly bad that cities saw the tragic rise of what were called rat children, kids who literally fled their violent alcoholic homes to live on the streets. When you look at the harsh reality of this, it becomes incredibly clear why a massive anti-alcohol movement felt not just justified, but entirely necessary to save society. That sheer societal devastation is what sparked a desperate, organized counter-movement. Which brings us to Chapter 2, the Crusade Against Alcohol. This movement slowly built from isolated protests into an absolute political juggernaut. It started out peacefully enough in 1840 with the Washingtonians, which was basically a support group for alcoholics taking pledges of sobriety. By 1873, you have the Women's Crusade, where women were literally praying outside pharmacies and saloons, begging the owners to stop selling liquor. And then things really escalated. In 1900, a woman named Carrie Nation, whose husband had actually died of alcohol poisoning, began physically walking into saloons and smashing liquor bottles with rocks and a hatchet. Eventually, all of this frantic energy was highly organized into the Anti-Saloon League, and they were effective. By 1913, they had successfully lobbied to ban alcohol in 9 different states. But the Anti-Saloon League faced one massive, seemingly impossible hurdle if they wanted to pass a nationwide ban. At the time, America was producing 90 million barrels of alcohol a year, and the tax on that alcohol made up a whopping 70% of the federal government's entire revenue. 70%! So how on earth do you convince a government to ban its main source of income? Well, you give them a replacement. The Temperance movement strategically threw its weight behind the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal government to collect an income tax. They essentially told the politicians, hey, don't tax the liquor, just tax our paychecks instead. Once that massive money issue was solved, the final calculated steps just fell right into place. First, the Anti-Saloon League essentially created the most powerful political lobby in U.S. history up to that point. They threatened to ruin the career of any politician who didn't vote dry. Second, they cleverly leveraged the outbreak of World War I. They framed the wealthy German-American beer barons as literal enemies of the state, arguing that grain should be used to feed our soldiers overseas, not to make poison for Americans. Under that immense pressure, Congress finally caved. The 18th Amendment was ratified, making the absolute ban the law of the land by January 1920. And this leads us to the messy reality of implementing the ban. Let's look at Chapter 3, the Prohibition Experiment.
Now, think about this. How do you actually enforce a nationwide ban on a substance that millions of people use every single day? Well, the federal government pointed fingers and argued it was the state's problem. The states pointed right back and argued it was the federal government's problem. As a result, they created a severely underfunded Prohibition Bureau with a grand total of just 1,500 officers to cover the entire United States. Most of these officers were totally untrained, horribly paid, and hired entirely through political connections. It was basically the perfect recipe for profound, widespread corruption.
And oh man, the loopholes were massive. For instance, it was actually still legal for pharmacies to sell medical whiskey. So, unsurprisingly, doctors suddenly wrote 6 million prescriptions for medicinal liquor. Then you had the sheer geography of the situation. America shares an 8,000-kilometer porous border with Canada, which made overland smuggling an absolute breeze. At sea, U.S. jurisdiction only extended 3 miles out into the ocean. So international bootlegger ships formed what was called Rum Row, literally a floating city of ships anchored just outside that 3-mile line, legally selling premium European liquor to super-fast American speedboats in the dead of night. Criminal masterminds like Chicago lawyer George Remus even bought up medical liquor factories and pharmacy chains. He was functionally stealing his own legally produced liquor out the back door to sell on the black market for astronomical prices.
This massive, hyper-lucrative black market takes us right into our darkest chapter, Chapter 4, Rise of the Mafia. By entirely eliminating legal, regulated businesses, the government inadvertently handed one of the largest industries in the entire country directly over to violent criminals. $60 million. That was Al Capone's annual profit from a Chicago bootlegging empire during Prohibition. To put that into perspective, adjusted for inflation today, that's roughly $1 billion a year in pure profit. Small-time street thugs, guys who previously just pickpocketed or ran small scams, suddenly found themselves managing complex international supply chains. A crate of whiskey bought for $5 in Canada was being sold for $80 in the States. This incomprehensible amount of wealth completely transformed random thugs into highly structured, incredibly powerful organized crime syndicates. And what exactly happens when illegal cartels with billion-dollar revenues start fighting over territory? You get an all-out war. A law that was explicitly designed and passed to clean up society actually triggered a massive explosion of violent crime. By 1926, overall crime was up 24%. Murders jumped by 12%. Syndicates were using the newly invented automobiles to conduct terrifying drive-by shootings, gunning down rivals in broad daylight, and tragically, often catching innocent civilians right in the crossfire. So you might be asking yourself, where were the police during all this? Well, the cartels simply bought the very institutions that were meant to stop them. In Chicago alone, it was estimated that an unbelievable 60% of the police force was actively on the mob's payroll. Al Capone even funded the campaign of the most corrupt mayor in American history, Bill Thompson, dropping a massive $250,000 bribe. Bootleggers were openly bragging that every single level of the Justice Department, from local beat cops all the way up to assistant attorney generals, was taking a cut. As the justice system totally collapsed, the everyday experience of simply getting a drink changed drastically. Chapter 5. Speakeasies and Poison. With high-quality smuggled liquor becoming way too expensive for the average working-class person, a terrifying public health crisis quickly emerged. People started making bathtub gin. Because pure, safe alcohol wasn't legally available anymore, people started buying industrial-grade cleaning alcohol and just mixing it with flavorings right in their own bathtubs. The really terrifying part was that this alcohol was often heavily contaminated, or worse, purposefully poisoned by the government in a misguided attempt to discourage people from drinking it, driving a highly demanded product completely underground with zero safety regulations proved to be absolutely lethal. Just look at the numbers. In 1926 alone, 1,200 people in New York died directly from poisoned alcohol. By 1930, 50,000 Americans were permanently paralyzed by a tainted concoction on the black market known as Jake. People were just desperate. It got to the point where legal manufacturers of yeast started printing these bizarrely specific warnings on their packaging that read something like, "Do not mix this with sugar and warm water and leave it in a dark place as it will turn into alcohol." Obviously, it wasn't a warning at all. It was a secret brewing recipe. And the price of grape concentrate mysteriously skyrocketed from $9 to $375 a ton as families rushed to secretly make wine at home.
But here's the crazy thing. Despite the very real danger of dying or going blind, the cultural desire to drink actually intensified. By the late 1920s, there were 23,000 hidden speakeasies operating in New York City alone. Drinking completely transformed. It went from being viewed as a depressing habit of the older generation into this incredibly rebellious, fashionable act for the youth. This is exactly where the famous flappers emerged. Young women cutting their hair short, drinking and smoking in open defiance of the law. Speakeasies were completely hidden behind passwords and fake storefronts. Some of the high-end ones even featured these brilliant mechanical bars that could flip over and disappear right into the wall at the press of a button the absolute second the police raided the building. But eventually, the sheer chaos of it all became entirely unsustainable. Which brings us to our final chapter. Chapter 6, Repeal and Modern Dilemmas. The turning point really arrived with a perfect storm of horrific violence and sudden economic collapse. In February 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre happened. Al Capone's men, actually dressed as police officers, lined up and brutally executed 7 rival gang members. This deeply, deeply shocked the nation. Everyday people finally realized that the law was essentially funding domestic terrorists. Then, in October 1929, the Great Depression hit. Millions of people lost their jobs overnight, and the government's income tax revenue practically vanished. Suddenly, the federal government desperately needed that old alcohol tax money back. So, in April 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt legalized beer just to stimulate the economy, and by December, the 21st Amendment officially repealed Prohibition altogether. But as we pivot back to the present day, it's absolutely vital that we look at all of this impartially. Yes, Prohibition was a colossal failure of execution. But we have to acknowledge that the original problem it tried to solve never actually went away. Take a look at the modern annual impact of alcohol in America today. We are looking at $249 billion in economic losses and 178,000 alcohol-related deaths every single year. The devastating societal costs that originally provoked the 1920s ban, they are still incredibly real right now. Which brings us to the end of our explainer and leaves us with this profound, really difficult question. How do we prevent an evil without inadvertently causing a much greater evil? When exactly does the government have the right to step in and say, this is destroying society, we have to ban it, versus stepping back and saying, we can only advise you, the ultimate choice is yours? It's a fundamental question about the limits of legislation. And as the Prohibition experiment so violently proved, sometimes the cure really can be far worse than the disease. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today. If you enjoyed the way we broke down this topic through these slides, be sure to check out our other